The substitute. They always said there was something strange about our school, especially the older wing. It was one of those ancient buildings that should have been condemned years ago, with its creaking floors, flickering lights, and the persistent smell of mildew no janitor could ever seem to fix. I always thought the stories were just exaggerations until that day. It started on a gloomy Monday, the kind of day where even the sun seemed too tired to show up. Our regular homeroom teacher, Mrs. Keller, was out sick. In her place, we had a substitute, a man who called himself Mr. Grayson. When he walked into the classroom, the air seemed to grow colder. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked like it was carved from stone. Sharp angles, hollow cheeks, and eyes so dark they almost seemed black. He didn't smile or greet us, just stood at the front of the room, scanning us like he was sizing us up for something. "Roll call," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like it came from somewhere deep underground. One by one, he called out our names. But something about the way he said them made my skin crawl. He didn't just say our names. He lingered on them, like he was tasting them. When he got to mine, I swear I felt my chest tighten. "Lena Matthews," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Here," I managed to squeak, my voice barely audible. He nodded but didn't move on right away. His gaze stayed fixed on me for what felt like an eternity before he finally looked back at the roster. The rest of the morning was uneventful, but the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. It wasn't just me. Everyone seemed on edge. Even the class clown, Ryan, who usually couldn't go 5 minutes without cracking a joke, was silent. At lunch, my best friend Emily and I sat in our usual spot in the cafeteria. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you notice anything weird about Mr. Grayson?" she asked. "Weird how?" I replied, though I already knew what she meant. "I don't know. He just feels wrong. Like he's not supposed to be here." I nodded, not wanting to admit that I felt the same. The entire time we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. The afternoon passed in a haze. Mr. Grayson barely taught. Instead, he made us sit in silence and read from our textbooks. But even though the room was quiet, I could hear things. Faint whispers that didn't seem to come from anyone in the class. They were low and garbled, like a broken radio signal, and every time I looked around to see if anyone else heard them, they were all staring straight ahead, unblinking. By the time the final bell rang, I was desperate to leave. Emily and I gathered our things and headed for the front doors. But as we passed the hallway leading to the old wing, we heard it. A noise that stopped us in our tracks. It was a low growl, deep and guttural like an animal. But it wasn't just a sound. It felt like it vibrated through the floor, rattling my bones. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Let's go check it out," she said. "Are you crazy?" I hissed. "What if it's—" "Don't be such a chicken," she interrupted, already heading down the hall. I hesitated for a moment before following her. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. As we got closer to the door at the end, the growling grew louder, more insistent. "Emily, I don't think this is a good idea," I said, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Inside was the old science lab and used for years. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and something else. Something metallic, like blood. "Emily, let's go," I pleaded, but she had already stepped inside. I followed reluctantly, my stomach churning. The room was dark, the only light coming from the cracked window at the far end. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, hunched over a pile of something I couldn't identify, was a figure. It was massive, its back hunched, with long, twisted limbs that didn't look human. Its skin was gray and leathery, and when it turned its head toward us, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth a jagged mess of teeth that didn't fit together properly. Emily screamed, and the thing roared, the sound deafening in the small room. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. We sprinted down the hallway, the sound of its footsteps pounding behind us. It was fast, faster than anything that size should have been. I could feel its breath on my neck, hot and rancid. We burst into the main hallway, but the school was empty. The front doors were locked, the windows barred. Panic surged through me as I realized we were trapped. "What do we do?" Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. Before I could answer, the lights flickered and went out. The growling was everywhere now, echoing off the walls. And then, out of the darkness, came Mr. Grayson's voice. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said, his tone cold and calm. The lights flickered back on, and he was standing in front of us, his face eerily blank. "What is that thing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "It's not a thing," he said, stepping closer. "It's the school's guardian, and it doesn't like trespassers." "Guardian?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Grayson tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "This school is older than it seems," he said. "Older than you can imagine, and it requires sacrifices." Before we could react, the creature lunged out of the shadows, its claws tearing through the air. I grabbed Emily's hand and ran, my mind racing. We had to find a way out. We ducked into a classroom, slamming the door shut behind us. The creature slammed against it, the wood splintering under the force. "There's no way out," Emily sobbed. "Yes, there is," I said, spotting a vent near the ceiling. "Help me up." We scrambled into the vent, crawling through the narrow space as the creature roared below us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When we finally emerged, we were in the janitor's closet near the back exit. I grabbed a mop handle, holding it like a weapon as we made our way to the door. But just as we reached it, Mr. Grayson appeared again, blocking our path. "You can't leave," he said. I didn't think. I just swung the mop handle as hard as I could, connected with his head, and he crumpled to the ground. We didn't wait to see if he was unconscious or worse. We threw open the door and ran into the night, not stopping until we reached the main road. To this day, I don't know what that thing was or why Mr. Grayson protected it. The school closed down shortly after, rumors of disappearances finally catching up with the administration. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that growl in my dreams. And when I do, I wake up with the feeling that something is watching me, just beyond the darkness. The monster in room 104. They say every school has its secrets, but I always thought they were just stories meant to keep kids in line. Don't stay late after class, or don't go into the old boiler room, things like that. I never believed any of it until the night I stayed late to finish my science project and found out the hard way that my school's secret was all too real. It started innocently enough. I had procrastinated on my project for weeks, and it was due the next day. Mrs. Hanover, my science teacher, had given me one last chance to finish it. "You can use the lab after school," she said. "Just lock up when you're done." The idea of staying late didn't bother me, at least not at first. The school felt different after hours, though. Quieter, darker. The kind of quiet where every creak and groan of the old building seemed louder than it should. Still, I had work to do, so I set up in the lab and got to it. By the time I looked up from my work, the sun had already set. The only light came from the buzzing fluorescent fixtures overhead. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. I told myself it was just the storm rolling in, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 8 p.m., I heard it for the first time, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my pencil hovering over my notebook. Probably just a janitor, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't a normal sound. It was deep and resonant, like an animal. But what kind of animal would be in a school? I stood up and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty, the long stretch of lockers and linoleum floor bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. Shaking my head, I went back to the lab. I told myself I was being paranoid. The old building made weird noises all the time. That's what old buildings did. Still, I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to that sound. Then, just as I was about to give up and pack my things, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside the lab. My heart began to race. "Hello!" I called again, louder this time. No response. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 8:17 p.m. The janitor usually locked up around 8:30. Maybe it was him, I thought. But when I stepped into the hallway, it was still empty. "Okay. Very funny," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "If someone's messing with me, it's not funny." Again, no response. I was about to go back into the lab when I saw it. A shadow at the far end of the hallway. It was massive, hunched over, with long, spindly arms that seemed too long for its body. It moved slowly, almost lazily, its head swaying from side to side as if sniffing the air. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a person. The thing stopped and turned its head toward me. Even from that distance, I could see its eyes, two glowing orbs, like burning coals. I stumbled backward into the lab, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the lock in place. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the footsteps started again, heavier this time, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against the tile floor. I pressed my back against the door, holding it shut with all my strength. "Go away," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The thing outside didn't listen. It let out a low growl, followed by a sickening scraping sound as its claws dragged across the door. I had to think. The lab had windows, but they were too small to climb through. The only other exit was the supply closet at the back of the room. The scraping stopped, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it had gone away. But then I heard a new sound, a wet, tearing noise, like flesh being ripped apart. The door began to splinter. I bolted for the supply closet, slamming the door shut behind me. The space was cramped, filled with shelves of chemicals and equipment. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light bounced off the walls, casting long, flickering shadows. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The sound of the lab door crashing open echoed through the room. It was inside. I could hear it moving, its heavy footsteps shaking the floor. It sniffed the air, letting out low, guttural growls. My phone buzzed, the vibration loud in the silence. I looked at the screen, Emily. I silenced it immediately, but it was too late. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the footsteps started again. Slower this time, deliberate. They stopped just outside the supply closet. I pressed myself against the back wall, clutching a glass beaker I had grabbed off the shelf. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The doorknob rattled. "Please, no," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The door creaked open, and for the first time I saw it up close. It was massive, its body covered in matted fur and scars. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and animal, with a wide, toothy grin that stretched impossibly far. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it let out a guttural snarl. I threw the beaker as hard as I could. It shattered against its face, and the creature roared in pain. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted out of the closet, dodging past the creature and sprinting down the hallway. The school was a maze, every hallway looking the same in the dim light. The creature's roars echoed behind me, growing louder with every step. I reached the front doors and yanked on them, but they wouldn't budge. "Come on!" I screamed, pounding on the glass. The creature rounded the corner, its glowing eyes locked onto me. I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and smashed it against the glass. It shattered, and I scrambled through the opening, cutting my hands and knees on the shards. I ran into the night, not stopping until I reached the main road. When I finally looked back, the school was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. The police didn't believe me, of course. They said I must have imagined it, that the stress of the project had gotten to me. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it. The sound of claws scraping against the floor, echoing in the back of my mind. The Beast of Willow Creek School. I never believed the rumors about Willow Creek School until I experienced them firsthand. I thought the stories of disappearances, ghostly sightings, and strange sounds were nothing more than old wives' tales, exaggerated to scare new students. Even when I heard whispers about the beast in the basement, I laughed it off. But that all changed on one unforgettable, horrifying night. It was the week before Christmas break, and I had been assigned to organize the school's end-of-year party. As the head of the student council, I took pride in my responsibilities, even if it meant staying late to decorate and finalize details. Most of the other students had already left for the day, and by 6 p.m., I was the last one in the building. The school felt eerily quiet in the evenings. During the day, the echoing halls and chatter of students made the place feel alive. But at night, the silence wrapped itself around you like a heavy blanket. Even the creaks and groans of the old building seemed unnaturally loud. I was in the auditorium, hanging garlands and arranging tables, when I first heard it, a faint scratching sound. I froze, my hand hovering over a stack of tinsel. The noise came again, louder this time, like claws raking against wood. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement stairs, just beyond the auditorium. Probably just rats, I muttered, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Willow Creek was notorious for its pest problems, but deep down I wasn't convinced. The sound had a deliberate, almost rhythmic quality to it, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it and focused on my work, but the noise persisted. After about 15 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight from the supply closet, I decided to investigate. I told myself I was being silly, that it was probably nothing, but my curiosity got the better of me. The basement was a part of the school most students avoided. It was cold, damp, and reeked of mildew. The janitors stored their cleaning supplies there, but otherwise it was abandoned. As I descended the narrow staircase, the air grew colder, and the faint scent of decay tickled my nose. The scratching had stopped by the time I reached the bottom. The dim beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating rows of dusty shelves and cobweb-covered pipes. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, hollow and unsettling. Silence. Just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye. A door at the far end of the basement, slightly ajar. I was sure it had been locked before. Every student knew that door led to the old boiler room, which had been sealed off years ago after an accident. No one was supposed to go in there, but now it was open. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. This is stupid, I told myself. Just go back upstairs. But something compelled me forward. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing coming from behind the door. I pushed it open slowly, the creaking hinges slicing through the silence. The room beyond was dark, colder than the rest of the basement, and filled with an unnatural stillness. My flashlight revealed rusted machinery, old pipes, and a floor coated in grime. In the corner, I noticed a pile of what looked like old uniforms, shredded and stained with dark, dried streaks. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. A hunched figure, its back to me, crouched over something on the floor. It was massive, with long, sinewy limbs and skin that looked like it had been stretched too tight over its skeletal frame. Its head was bald and misshapen, and its fingers ended in razor-sharp claws. I must have made a sound because it suddenly stopped what it was doing and turned its head toward me. Its face was hideous, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, a mouth filled with jagged, uneven teeth, and a twisted expression that seemed almost human. It snarled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The creature rose to its full height, towering over me, its long arms dragging along the ground. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it lunged. I screamed and bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear its claws scraping against the floor, the sound growing louder with each passing second. I reached the stairs and scrambled up them, taking two at a time. The creature let out a deafening roar, shaking the very walls of the school. Bursting into the hallway, I slammed the basement door shut and jammed a nearby chair under the handle. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. For a moment, there was silence. Then the pounding began. The door shook violently as the creature slammed against it, snarling and growling like a rabid animal. I didn't wait to see if the door would hold. I ran. The hallways were a blur as I sprinted toward the main entrance. My only thought was to get out of the building and find help. But when I reached the front doors, they wouldn't budge. They were locked tight, the old, rusted mechanisms refusing to give. Panic set in as I pounded on the glass, screaming for help. Outside, the snow fell silently, the world oblivious to my terror. A loud crash echoed behind me. I turned to see the basement door hanging off its hinges, the creature crawling into the hallway. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, and it let out a guttural roar that shook me to my core. I ran again, ducking into the nearest classroom and barricading the door with desks and chairs. My hands trembled as I dialed 911 on my phone, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. The sound of claws scraping against the walls grew closer. The creature was toying with me, its growls and snarls echoing through the halls. It knew I was trapped, and it was enjoying the chase. Hours seemed to pass as I huddled in the corner of the classroom, clutching a broken chair leg like a makeshift weapon. The creature's noises had stopped, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. The silence was almost worse than the growls. Then, just as dawn began to break, I heard the faint sound of sirens. A wave of relief washed over me as I realized someone had called the police. I peeked out the window and saw their flashing lights in the parking lot. But when I turned back toward the door, the creature was there, its grotesque face inches from mine. It smiled, a twisted, horrifying grin, and whispered in a voice that sounded almost human, "See you soon." Then it was gone. The police didn't find any trace of the creature, and the school dismissed my story as a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, and every time I pass by the school, I can feel its eyes on me, waiting. The Monster of Maplewood Middle School. I've always hated staying after school, but that Friday night was different. Maplewood Middle School felt lifeless once the sun dipped below the horizon, its long hallways stretching like the maw of some dormant beast. Yet there I was, stuck in detention, the last person in the building, or so I thought. Detention that day wasn't even my fault. Someone had stolen Mr. Peterson's phone and blamed me, and the grumpy old math teacher bought their story. By the time I finished writing my punishment essay, Why Honesty Matters, it was nearly 7 p.m. I figured I'd drop it on his desk and head out the back door, which was always unlocked by the janitor at this hour. When I stepped into the hall, the silence was suffocating. My sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor, each sound amplified in the void. Somewhere far off, a clock ticked ominously. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering every so often. I passed a row of lockers, their dull, scratched surfaces glowing faintly in the dim light, and froze. One of them, locker 237, was open. Wide open. That wasn't right. Lockers were supposed to be shut after hours. I stepped closer, peering inside. It was empty except for a small puddle of something. It shimmered under the light, black and viscous, like oil but thicker. I wrinkled my nose at the sharp, metallic tang. Blood? No, it smelled wrong, like rot and something metallic had been fused together. I stepped back, suddenly uneasy, and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging slowly across a chalkboard. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, but the hall was empty. The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. It was coming from the basement. Every kid at Maplewood Middle knew the stories about the basement. Decades ago, it had been sealed off after a fire, though no one knew the full details. Some claimed the janitor had gone crazy and locked a student down there. Others said the fire started when the science teacher accidentally created a chemical explosion. Whatever the truth was, the basement was off limits now, the door bolted shut with rusted chains. But tonight, as I walked down the hall, I saw the door to the basement wide open. The scraping sound echoed up from the darkness below, rhythmic and deliberate. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself from stepping closer. "Hello!" My voice cracked, echoing down the stairwell. No answer. I should have turned around and left. I should have run home and told myself it was just my imagination. But something about the sound pulled me forward, as though it had hooked itself into my very mind. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs. The basement was worse than I imagined. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something foul. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, revealing rows of rusted pipes and cracked tiles. The scraping sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the corridor. It was covered in peeling paint, and the word "boiler room" was stenciled across it in faded letters. My fingers hesitated on the knob, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, won out. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space filled with old machinery and shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, hunched over a pile of shredded cloth and what looked like bones, was the monster. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Long, bony fingers ended in claws that scraped against the floor as it moved. Its head was too large for its body, with hollow, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. But its mouth was the worst part. It was impossibly wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth that gnashed together as it chewed on its grisly meal. I froze, unable to breathe. The creature stopped eating, its head snapping toward me with an unnatural speed. It sniffed the air, and a low growl rumbled from its chest. I took a step back, and the floorboard creaked under my weight. That was all it took. The monster let out an ear-splitting shriek and lunged toward me, its claws slicing through the air. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled back up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard it behind me, its claws scraping against the walls, its growls growing louder. I reached the main floor and slammed the basement door shut, jamming a chair under the handle. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, but the pounding on the door told me it wouldn't hold for long. I needed to get out of there. The front doors were locked, but I remembered the janitor always left the back door open. I sprinted through the darkened halls, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The creature's roars echoed behind me, closer now. Finally, I reached the back door. It was ajar just as I'd hoped. Relief flooded through me as I pushed it open, the cold night air hitting my face. But before I could step outside, something slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. My flashlight skittered away, plunging me into darkness. The creature loomed over me, its glowing eyes burning into mine. It let out a guttural snarl, its jagged teeth glinting in the faint moonlight. In a desperate bid for survival, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it with all my might, smashing it into the creature's face. It howled in pain, recoiling just enough for me to scramble to my feet. I bolted through the door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, slamming the door shut behind me. My parents were out for the evening, so I locked every door and window and sat in the living room, trembling with fear. The monster didn't follow me that night, but I know it's still out there. The school closed down the following week, citing structural issues, but I know the truth. Whatever that thing was, it's still in the basement, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of claws scraping against wood.